It is better to be a warrior in a garden than a gardener in a war. Or so you have heard it said by someone like Musashi Moyomoto. And this phrase is repeated time and time again ad nauseum as if it were to convince us that it is better to be capable of going to war and not be required to, rather than find ourselves in a position where we are under siege or in conflict and not be capable of fighting in it. And if it were so simple and so short and so trite as that, we would be able to go on in life without this lesson. But there is a war going on. There are multiple conflicts going on across the world. And if we were to take some of the frustration of someone like Tim Pool, we might look at the war in Ukraine as something as simple as those who are fighting in the war, at least against the Russians or whatever, might be tied to the military-industrial conflict or complex. And it raises this question. There is a difference between why men go off to war and why men join the military. And so these are the concepts that we're going to explore in this episode of the Redacted Culture Cast, episode 216, Why Men Go Off to War. It's not an easy subject to broach. It's not a short and trite component, but it is something that we can begin to explore in this episode. So let's start with the sponsorship. Let's start with who has invested into the intellectual side of gun culture, and that is none other than Obsidian Arms. Now, Obsidian Arms produces a series of tools and toolkits that address the various facets of gun culture. They are capable of producing pieces of equipment that you can use to build the things that you're working on, whether it is professionally or in the garage variety, but that is only a window into their capacity of manufacturing. And so if you're trying to bring a product to market, then and you don't want to try to build your own shop to build it, or you're willing to work with somebody else who has years of experience, decades of experience in building these kind of components and presents a fair price to you, you might want to consider going to Obsidian Arms at obsidianarms.com. And just a side note, just a comma in the conversation. If you buy one of their toolkits, each individual tool comes with a lifetime warranty. You break a part, you send it back to them, they send it back to you, you're good to go. So that is them. They have chosen to sponsor the show, and for that we are thankful. So this episode is going to require a period of time to break down because it begins with a series of distinctions or differences between certain ideas. First of all, and first and foremost, the reason why someone might go off to war is not the same thing that a person will say as to why they may have joined the military. And I'll use this as an example. Let's go back to 2008, August of 2008, and you have a young soldier in basic training. This man is there. We're going to assume that it's a man just for the sake of the conversation. This person is in basic training. He is trying to figure out how this new world works. It's different than where he came from. He joined the military for various reasons. One of them might be to get away from home or to try to build a career for himself or a desire for the call to adventure. But that person is sitting there or not sitting there, he's standing there, toe the line as they phrase. And the drill sergeant will ask him as he goes down the line, asking each basic trainee, why did they join the military? And you might hear various things like a sense of patriotism, doing my duty to my country. I wanted to serve my country. I wanted to earn a position of honor. I wanted to be a soldier. I wanted to become something. And all of these answers are oftentimes kind of reduced to this simplistic form of answering the question for the sake of the drill sergeant. Now they're answering this question in a context. That context is the military. They are being asked in front of all of these people that they have only recently met, why did they even come there to begin with? But the answers that they give may or may not be as deep as the true answer as to why they joined. And so you have to go again and imagine this person in basic training. They might have said that they joined the military out of a sense of patriotism. Again, it's 2008. You've got the economic crash on their heels. They might be thinking about where their family is at, where their parents or their loved ones are at economically. Their mind might be divided between passing the next phase or the pressing conditions that they are up against, at least within the context of a basic training course. Meanwhile, they're also being torn in the sense of wondering, how are things at home? Do their parents still own their home? Have they lost it in the crash? Are their siblings all right? Are they doing well in school? Is his sister's boyfriend a good person? And so on and so forth. And so you might have to start asking the question as to, why do people join the military, as opposed to why do men go off to war? There's a recent video that has gone viral, I believe through Twitter, now X, and other forms of social media, that depicts a bunch of people fighting in a war, or fighting in a conflict supposedly against the Russians. I'm not going to make assumptions here, but the imposition of the video that has gone viral is that you have people of multiple different nationalities in a firefight against those who are perceived or determined to be Russians. And this is in the context of the Ukrainian Civil War. Or not the Ukrainian Civil War, the Ukrainian-Russian War. And this criticism, you can find it all across X, is that one of the main people, or in fact the main person, the main voice heard in this video, clearly is or has an American, not even accent, but an American vernacular and dialect when it comes to how he speaks. And so you get this idea that the person who's fighting, even though America is not formally being claimed to be in the war with Ukraine against Russia, there are people who are on the ground who are Americans, or at least perceived to be Americans, fighting on behalf of Ukraine or so forth. And this is contrasted against the criticism against what will be colloquially referred to as the military-industrial complex, which is accused of being okay with or encouraging war for the sake of financial profit. And there's an important thing that, if I want to start with a distinction, is that the reasons people go to war is not the same thing as the perceived goals of a thing referred to as the military-industrial complex. And it is not I don't think it is a right answer to say that a person who chooses to go to war does so for the sake or being convinced solely by the actions of what we call the military-industrial complex. And this is not an emotionally satisfying start, but it is somewhere where we have to begin. So let's start with a series of questions. Why do men go off to war? And how is this different than why people will join the military? We can start by answering the second question. People might join the military, not for the explicit purpose of going off to war, but to establish some economic stability for their family. They might join the military for a sense of duty to their country. They might join the military to have their college paid for by the GI Bill. They might join the military because at least it's a pathway out of their current socioeconomic status. They might join the military because the military is presented to them as an honorable profession. They might join the military because they believe that the military is a pathway or a rite of passage. But all of these answers are very different. In fact, can be very clearly distinguished, maybe distinction is not really a verb in that sense, but distinguished from why someone might go to war. And the example of this is the number of people who go to war without joining a said military. And we will get to this, we will tie this back in at the end with those who have this sense regarding war, despite the fact of never joining the military. So let's also break down another layer. We first started with a series of distinguishing questions. Why do men go off to war versus why do men join the military? And the second set of questions that we might ask is, if we're going to look at somebody, we might ask, one, why do men join the military? Which is followed by, what do men in the military experience? Which is again followed by, how do men suffer after leaving the military? These three questions, again, are trying to illustrate that there is a deep disconnect between this idea of joining the military as a profession and also going to war. Now, the accusation that is frequently leveled against this idea that is called the military-industrial complex is that they might encourage war for financial profit. This is a old idea. It has been around for some time, and it alone needs to be divorced from the reasons why men will go to war, because the military-industrial complex alone, unless your sole modus operandi for truth discernment is propaganda, if you're able to recognize that people don't solely make decisions on the basis of propaganda, because we're not savants that can somehow be enlightened beyond all sorts of deception, the things that motivate people to, in this way, go to war can be, and oftentimes in a much more personal level, are very different than, say, the profit motives of a military-industrial complex. The shortened formed, perhaps even straw man perspective, and I'm going to admit that this might be a bit of a straw man argument, is that those who accuse the military-industrial complex of using propaganda to convince young men, especially young men of lower or middle socioeconomic status, to go to war, use propaganda in order to promote war, in order to profit from said war. And that is the only reason, their propaganda is the only reason why men go to war. But you must ask the question, how then, if this is true, is that propaganda so effective? And even if it's effective, what system, desire, or motive is it hijacking to dissuade people? There is this idea, there's this criticism about, or not criticism, there's this concern about people who leave the military regarding something like post-traumatic stress disorder, or this idea of disenfranchisement of those who have left the military. And one might start to beg the question, is it the false promise of the military-industrial complex which ultimately leads in this crisis of identity in these people? Now, I haven't done a great job of clarifying this jumbling connection of ideas, because not only is it not quite as simple as a cut and paste split idea, but it has to be explored in its fullness. And so we started with, why do men go off to war is a different question than why do men join the military. We've also started tracking through why men join the military is going to be different than the experiences that they have in the military, which is going to be different than the suffering that they experience after leaving the military. And we've talked about a little bit of this military-industrial complex, and I've tried to highlight or begin to draw attention to something that is perhaps closer to home than is comfortable. And that is that there might be over here, off to the side, the motives, profit motives of a military-industrial complex, but those motives are different than the motives which might inspire a man to go to war. Even if there was no profit, there's no contractor money, there is no bougie Blackwater world that somebody gets to be a part of, what would draw a man to go off to war? Well, what are the movies that we watch? Braveheart, Gladiator, Last of the Mohicans. Those are the classics of the 90s into the early 2000s. You've got Lord of the Rings. You've got, even to some extent, the Marvel movies. You've got this issue, Band of Brothers, that call people to a purpose greater than themselves. And this criticism that is leveled against the military industrial complex does not oftentimes stick, or nor is it even effective against those who actually choose to go off to war. Now, the war in Ukraine, the Ukrainian-Russian war, isn't necessarily unique, but in our contemporary era has one distinguishing element that seems to set it apart from so many others, and that is that so many of the people who are fighting in said war are not explicitly tied to the land for which they are fighting. You have early on in the conflict, you had a list of people, some of them seeking glory, some of them seeking fame, some of them seeking their moment in the sun or their sense of adventure, traveled to Ukraine or to that part of the world to go fight in this war. And there was this international legion that supposedly stood up to house and bring in all these people. And then there were these stories of conflict that happened afterwards, where those who came to join didn't really get the how do you call it? They didn't really get the warm welcome that they were expecting. Maybe they didn't have the skill sets that they really thought they had, or the skill set that they had, like, say, being able to fire an AK-47, wasn't nearly as useful as the needed skills like how to set up a logistic supply line, how to perform reconnaissance, how to do ambushes and counter ambushes, and how to develop an area in a non-permissive environment, not to plug Travis Haley in unintentionally. And so men go off to war for many reasons. Now, if we were going to approach the Russian-Ukrainian war, especially from the volunteers' perspective, we might be able to get a window into why men do this. Men oftentimes go off to war to fulfill a sense of purpose, or at least that would be a single sentence presentation of what we might look at. And let's pull back to where this episode started. It is better to be a warrior in a garden than a gardener in a war, or at least Musashi Moyomoto said in the Book of Five Rings. Now the question is this true? In its simplest form, or in its utilitarian form, well, we would be pretty frank to say, yeah, I would rather be in a situation where my skill set of war making is not necessary, rather than find myself in an environment where those skills are needed and I don't have them. But with the experience that we've observed over the last 20 years of warfare, especially involving the West, America, and Afghanistan, Iraq, is that the quote is not all that true. We have lost far fewer men and women in combat over the last 20 years than we have men and women lost to suicide. And that suicide can be attributed to many things, but all of them, at least in its most black and white headline form, are men and women who have lived the lives of warriors. Let's not try to get into the levels of stolen valor in that argument, but men and women who have lived lives of being warriors who now find themselves in an unsatisfying garden. And there are stories, people that I know, people that you know, who fit this odd example of somebody who, there's a saying that goes, that man is a break glass in case of war type man, which means when he's in the United States, when he's in a time of peace, when he is trying to figure out a 9-to-5, it is utter and absolute chaos. But when you put him in a warlike environment, his neurons sharpen, his decision-making becomes razor sharp, he becomes faster, smarter, stronger, more articulate, and he is in his element. And this is a symptom of somebody who might go to war for reasons other than personal profit, financial gain, stability, or even the military-industrial complex. You can tell me that some people enjoy working in that field because they get paid $200, $300, $400, $500, $600, $700, $800, $900 a day, $1,000 a day to go carry a gun in a foreign country. But when you dig down into their motives, it is rarely solely the money. You see, the idea of a mercenary has been splayed out as some sort of generic black, not even camo, black black plate carrier, balaclava wearing, G36 wielding bad guy in a generic movie. But if you meet the people who are not satisfied with the pseudo peace that is the West, when they come home and they try to be at home, they fall apart. An example of this from the perspective of a journalist would be Lloyd, Anthony Lloyd, My War Gone By, I Miss It So. And you will see that these warriors in the garden oftentimes don't even thrive there. They don't thrive there. They don't even really survive there. And so if I'm going to go back and I'm going to ask you, the audience, some questions, if you joined the military, why did you join? Was it truly out of a sense of patriotism, or was there something deeper, more personal, something closer to the essence of your being or the desire of your life that directed you or inspired you to seek after joining the military? Was it really something as simple as economic gain, stability, or the GI Bill? Or was there something else, maybe a call to adventure, a desire for an honor culture, a desire to belong or to prove oneself in the world, a rite of passage which drew you to the military? And for those of you who have left the military and have even existed in the contracting world, what is it that drives you back there? And while there may be two forces at play, one of them is what attracts people to that life, the life of the soldier, the mercenary. There is another force, which is what expels you from your current environment. There's this movie that came out at this point in time quite a while ago, and it's based on a book. It's called Fight Club. The first rule of Fight Club is not to talk about Fight Club. But what happens in this film and what this film exemplifies is, or it tries to identify or illustrates, is that amongst these people, the world that they live in is not the world that they feel they belong to. The corporatocracy, or the corporate world, this continual churning machine of spreadsheets and profits and whatever, becomes repulsive. They're a shadow of who they should be. That they find a sense of belonging and maybe meaning or value in putting their skills to the test, or inducing pain and suffering through some sort of pelagic experience. This issue, and of course there's many other things to be brought up from the idea of Fight Club, begins to illustrate maybe a different way that we might approach why men go off to war. Because I can guarantee you there are men who are fighting in Ukraine right now who have no ties to the military-industrial complex. They're going to make no money off of this. They're not going to find some hero's honor. They're not going to be awarded medals and laurels. There's going to be no end of a Star Wars episode where they get their awards and are lauded as heroes. There's going to be no medal of honor for them, but they're out there because there they feel at home. They feel alive in what others might call the chaos. And you can imagine this perspective that a person has after experiencing war, going to war, fighting in these battles, learning how to do these things, that at least in that world, the world that they miss, my war gone by, I miss it so, at least in that world, there is cause and effect. There is a not only a regularity, but there is a objectivity to that experience. The gunfights that they were in were real. There is no question about whether or not they did or did not happen. It's not even their promotion, but their survival, their continuation, the decisions that they make in these high-pressure environments are at least real, despite the fear of life and the desire to live being put in strain. But if you come back to, say, the United States, and you take that person and you put him into corporate America, where the rules are mushy, and some people succeed despite failing at every level, and other people are passed up despite being invaluable to their organization, where one man speeds and drives drunk and gets home safe and sound every night, whereas another man has one too many beers one times and ends up with a DUI. This regularity is lacking in our world, be it investments or law or the legal system, or even trying to make their way in the world. And it would be short-sighted to say that all of those who fight in war do so on behalf of the military-industrial complex. If this idea, this let's just imagine it as a cabal, and this is required to be an imagination for the sake of this episode. Let's imagine there's a cabal of perfect marketing executives that are going to utilize the trends of the day to motivate those of lower intelligence and lower socioeconomic status to join the military, to go fight wars, to make profit for themselves. Do you really think that their ideas are perfectly correlated with the desires of the people who end up fighting those wars? If you think the answer is yes, I'm going to warn you that you're frighteningly short-sighted on this subject. Men often go off to war to prove themselves, to see who they really are, to seek after a life where cause leads to effect, where their actions have meaning, or at least their actions have consequences. And that is very often frighteningly not found in the world back home. So, why do men go off to war? Ultimately, this question is going to differ from one individual to another, but, and for certain, you can understand, and many of you know, that the answers that we give to our journals, to our history books, to our listeners, to those who ask the question, is not always the same as the answer that really gives us resolution. Many of us joined the military to go experience war for ourselves, not purely out of patriotism or a sense of duty. But how do you convey that to someone who's merely looking for a utilitarian answer, whether it's for a poll or a study or so forth? And this whole episode is meant to illustrate and point out that there is a difference between why men go off to war and why wars happen. And that difference can be illustrated and boiled down to be observed even within gun culture. Men and women do not pursue their own capability purely out of a sense of glory, and those that do quickly fade. And this might be a bridge between those who still hold on to the old vestigial ideas that there is a rift between those who were in the military and those who weren't, because both of those groups, both of those people are in desire often of seeking after something greater than themselves. So, this has been the Redacted Culture Cast. Thank you for listening. Leave a comment. Go forth and conquer.